They called him worthless. A walking skeleton, a horse bound for slaughter. At a noisy auction, no one raised a hand until a young girl stepped forward, risking everything on a creature everyone else had abandoned. What began as ridicule soon turned into a fight against fear, storms, greed, and doubt, until the bond between a broken horse and a stubborn girl rewrote their fate forever. The summer sun blazed mercilessly over the stockyard in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Dust swirled in the hot air, clinging to the boots of ranchers and the hats of traders. Voices echoed in a mix of laughter, bidding, and the sharp ring of the auctioneer's call. Horses paraded one after another, sleek, strong, their coats gleaming like polished copper in the light. Every time a fine animal stepped into the ring, the crowd hushed with admiration, and the bids climbed higher and higher. But then came a pause. A thin, trembling horse was led forward from a corner pen so neglected most hadn't even noticed it was there. The animal's ribs pushed out beneath a dull gray-brown coat streaked with dirt. Its head hung low, ears flicking weakly at the noise, as though every sound was too heavy to bear. One leg dragged slightly when the handler tugged on the rope, revealing a faint limp. A ripple of laughter rolled across the crowd. "That one looks like it came straight from the slaughter line," a man snorted, spitting into the dust. "Wouldn't even pull a cart," another added. "Best put it out of its misery." The horse didn't flinch at the insults. Its dark eyes carried no fight, no spark of defiance, only a hollow resignation, as if it had long ago stopped expecting kindness. The handler tugged harder on the rope, muttering under his breath, while the auctioneer tried to inject some energy into his voice. "All right, folks," the man called, though his tone wavered. "Here we have a horse in need of some care. Young enough still. Could be of use if someone's willing to put in the work. Who will start the bidding?" Silence answered. Hats tipped down, eyes turned away. A few chuckles broke the quiet, the sound sharper than any words. Nobody raised a hand. The horse stood alone, mocked and forgotten, a living shadow among the strong. Near the back of the crowd, Emily Walker froze. At 19, she was no stranger to livestock auctions. She had grown up trailing her father across dusty pens, memorizing the quick language of buyers and sellers. But today, she wasn't there to watch. She had saved every tip from late-night shifts at the local diner, every dollar earned mending fences and stacking hay on the ranch. Her plan was simple: buy a horse strong enough to help keep their small, failing ranch alive. Yet her gaze lingered not on the fine animals drawing whistles of admiration, but on the frail creature in the corner of the ring. Something in those dark, defeated eyes struck her like a stone to the chest. They weren't just the eyes of a broken horse. They were the eyes of something that had given up being seen. Emily's chest tightened. She heard her mother's voice from long ago, before sickness had taken her. Never judge a horse only by what the world sees. Look closer. Look with your heart. A man beside her shook his head, noticing her fixed stare. "Don't be foolish, girl. That bag of bones ain't worth the rope around its neck." His words were meant to be kind, a warning. But Emily didn't hear him. She stepped forward, the crowd parting slightly as if surprised she dared to move. The auctioneer blinked down at her, relief flickering across his face. "Do I hear a bid?" "I'll take him," Emily said, her voice steady though her palms trembled. The words struck like thunder. Heads turned, eyes wide with disbelief. Then came the laughter, louder this time, rolling over her like a wave. "She's lost her mind," someone jeered. "That horse'll drop dead before she gets it home." Emily ignored them, her gaze never leaving the animal. "What's the price?" she asked the auctioneer. He hesitated, almost pitying her. "Pay the minimum, and he's yours." Her hand went to the worn leather pouch slung across her shoulder. She drew out the crumpled bills, nearly every cent she owned, and pressed them into his hand. The gavel struck wood with a hollow thud. "Sold!" The laughter didn't fade. If anything, it grew louder, a cruel chorus that followed her as she stepped into the ring and took the rope. The horse lifted its head slightly, eyes searching hers, as though unsure what kind of punishment this new human might bring. Emily's voice softened. "From now on," she whispered, brushing dirt from its muzzle, "you're Rusty, and you'll never be unwanted again." The horse breathed out a long, shaky sigh. Behind them, the crowd jeered and muttered, but Emily stood taller, gripping the lead rope with quiet determination. She didn't know what lay ahead, only that she had made a choice no one else dared to. In that moment, under the burning Wyoming sun, a girl and a broken horse began a story no one in that stockyard would ever forget. The laughter still echoed in Emily's ears long after the gavel fell. She held Rusty's rope tightly in her hand, as though the fragile thread between them might be snapped if she loosened her grip. The crowd parted around her, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering sharp words that carried in the hot Wyoming air. A few even pointed and smirked, treating her purchase as little more than a joke to tell over whiskey that night. Emily's cheeks burned, but her eyes stayed fixed on Rusty. The horse swayed on unsteady legs, ribs rising and falling beneath the dust-matted coat. Every step seemed to test the limits of his body. When she tugged gently at the rope, Rusty hesitated, then followed with a stumble, as if surprised not to be yanked forward or struck. Emily bent low, whispering to him, though she knew the words might mean nothing yet. "It's all right, boy. We're going home." Outside the stockyard gates, her father was waiting. Sam Walker stood with his arms crossed, boots planted firm in the dirt, the sun glinting off the silver buckle at his waist. His face was weathered, cut deep by years of wind and war, but it was his eyes that made Emily's heart tighten. They were hard, sharp, filled with disbelief. "What in God's name did you just do?" he demanded, voice rough like gravel dragged over steel. Emily swallowed, but her grip on Rusty's rope didn't falter. "I bought him. His name is Rusty now." Sam's laugh was bitter, hollow. "Rusty? Emily, that animal's skin and bones. He won't survive a week, let alone help us on the ranch. You wasted money we don't have." Her jaw set, the familiar defiance rising in her chest. "I didn't waste it. Everyone else saw something worthless. I saw something different." Sam stepped closer, lowering his voice but not the force of his words. "Your mother's gone. The ranch is hanging by a thread. And you throw away our last savings on a crippled horse? We can't afford dreams, Emily." The mention of her mother cut deeper than any accusation. For a moment, Emily's breath caught, and she almost faltered. But then Rusty shifted beside her, pressing his head lightly against her shoulder, as if seeking shelter. The touch was weak, but real. Emily straightened. "We can't afford to give up either," she said softly but firmly. Sam stared at her, his silence heavier than anger. At last he shook his head, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. "Fine, he's yours, but don't expect me to lift a finger when he drops dead in that pasture." He turned sharply, boots grinding against the dirt as he strode toward the truck. Emily stood for a moment, the dust of the auction swirling around her, the weight of every mocking voice pressing against her back. But she did not let go of Rusty. Slowly, patiently, she coaxed him toward the narrow trail that led home. The journey was long, the afternoon heat punishing. Rusty stumbled often, his breath ragged, and more than once Emily thought he might collapse. She stopped every mile to rest him, wiping sweat from his trembling neck, whispering encouragement. "Just a little farther, boy. You're safe now." By the time the outline of their small ranch appeared against the orange glow of sunset, Emily's body ached, her boots heavy with dust. Sam was already on the porch, arms folded, watching. His disapproval radiated even from a distance. Yet behind the sharp lines of his expression, something flickered. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faintest spark of recognition that his daughter's stubbornness was something he had once carried himself. Rusty halted at the fence line, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar scents of hay and livestock. The ranch's other horses whinnied from their paddocks, strong and sleek, compared to the gaunt newcomer. Emily stroked Rusty's muzzle, her own exhaustion hidden behind determination. "This is home now," she whispered. "No one's going to laugh at you here." Sam descended the porch steps slowly, boots crunching in the gravel. He circled Rusty, his practiced eyes scanning the hollow flanks, the dull coat, the uneven gait. Finally, he grunted. "You've brought home a corpse on legs. If he lives through the week, it'll be a miracle." Emily bristled, but before she could reply, Sam pointed to the small pen beside the barn. "Put him there. And remember, you feed him, you train him, you prove he's worth the effort. He's yours and yours alone." For a moment, Emily thought he might relent, that perhaps her father would soften. But he only turned and walked back into the house, leaving her alone with the fading light and the fragile creature beside her. She led Rusty into the pen, untied the rope, and set a bucket of water down. He drank greedily, his whole frame trembling with the effort. Watching him, Emily's heart swelled with something fierce and unshakable. The world had already written him off, just as it had threatened to write her family off after her mother's death. But standing there, with the Wyoming sky blazing in streaks of red and gold, she made herself a promise. "No one's going to throw you away again," she said. Rusty lifted his head, water dripping from his muzzle, and for the first time his eyes seemed to meet hers. Not hollow, not empty, but questioning, as if wondering whether this girl might truly mean the words she spoke. Emily leaned against the fence, dust clinging to her sweat-soaked shirt, and smiled through her weariness. "You and me, Rusty. We're going to prove them all wrong." That night, long after the lights in the farmhouse had dimmed, Emily stayed by the pen. The moon rose over the rolling Wyoming hills, casting silver across the dry fields. Rusty stood close to the fence, his body frail, but his gaze fixed on the girl, who refused to leave his side. And in that quiet, a fragile bond took its first breath, born not from strength or glory, but from a choice the rest of the world had laughed at. The Wyoming dawn came harsh and cold, a pale light spilling over the ridges and settling on the Walker Ranch like a reluctant blessing. Emily woke before the rooster crowed, the ache of yesterday's journey still stiff in her muscles. When she pulled on her boots and stepped outside, the morning air bit at her skin, carrying with it the dry scent of sagebrush and dust. Her first thought wasn't of breakfast or chores, it was of Rusty. She hurried to the pen where he stood, half shrouded in mist. Rusty lifted his head at her approach, his ears twitching, but his body sagged with exhaustion. The water bucket from last night was nearly empty, and the hay she'd left remained untouched. Emily's chest tightened. She had hoped that once he was safe, he would eat, but the horse seemed locked in a silent battle with his own will. "Hey, boy," she murmured, stepping into the pen. Rusty flinched at the creak of the gate, but he didn't shy away as she reached for his muzzle. His skin was cool beneath her fingers, his breath faint. Emily forced a smile, masking the fear that gnawed at her. "You'll eat today. I'll make sure of it." From the porch, her father watched with folded arms, a cup of coffee steaming in his grip. His gaze was unreadable, but the disapproval radiated all the same. When Emily scattered a mix of oats and hay into Rusty's trough, Sam's voice carried across the yard, sharp as barbed wire. "He won't touch it. He's too far gone." Emily straightened, dust clinging to her jeans, and shot him a defiant look. "Then I'll find something he will eat." Sam snorted, took a long sip of coffee, and turned back into the house. His silence as the door shut was louder than any insult. The day stretched long and grueling. Emily mucked out stalls, repaired a broken fence, and carried water from the well, all while her thoughts circled back to Rusty. Every time she checked, the feed sat untouched. By late afternoon, the weight of despair pressed hard on her shoulders. She leaned against the fence, staring at him as the sun baked the earth around them. "Why won't you try?" she whispered. "Don't you know I chose you?" The horse flicked his tail weakly, his head lowering as if he carried a burden far heavier than his frail frame could hold. Emily bit her lip, refusing to let tears fall. Instead, she trudged to the barn, rummaging through feed bins until she found a handful of sweet alfalfa cubes. Returning to the pen, she knelt in the dust and held them out in her palm. Rusty eyed her hand suspiciously, nostrils flaring. For a long moment, he didn't move. Emily's arm trembled from holding still, but she dared not flinch. Then, slowly, hesitantly, Rusty stretched his neck forward and took a tentative nibble. Relief rushed through Emily so swiftly she almost laughed. "That's it, Rusty. Just a little. You can do this." He chewed, swallowed, then nudged her palm again. She gave him the rest of the cubes, her heart lifting with every bite. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That night, after the sun sank in streaks of crimson and violet, Emily lingered by his pen again. She sang softly, the words of an old country tune her mother used to hum while cooking in the kitchen. The melody floated in the cool night air, simple and raw, carrying memories that made her throat tighten. Rusty stood close to the fence, ears angled toward her voice, his dark eyes less hollow than the day before. Behind her, the screen door creaked. Sam stood in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the dim glow of the kitchen. For a moment he said nothing. His shoulders sagged slightly, his face shadowed with something that might have been weariness, or perhaps the faintest flicker of memory. But then he cleared his throat, and his voice came flat. "Don't fool yourself, Emily. That horse isn't a miracle. You can't sing him back to life." Emily turned, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "Maybe not. But I can give him something no one else did. Time." Sam didn't answer. He closed the door with a dull click, leaving Emily alone with the stars and the fragile creature at her side. Days turned into a rhythm of patience and persistence. Every morning, Emily tried new mixtures of feed, slipping in oats with alfalfa, coaxing Rusty to eat a little more. Every afternoon, she cleaned his pen, brushed the dirt from his coat, and spoke to him in a quiet voice meant to ease the shadows from his eyes. The work left her aching, her hands raw from rope and shovel, but each small victory, each mouthful, each tentative step filled her with a pride she hadn't felt in months. The townsfolk, however, weren't so kind. At the diner where Emily worked evenings, customers whispered and laughed. "That Walker girl bought herself a ghost horse," one man chuckled loud enough for her to hear. "She'll learn the hard way." Emily bit back her anger, focusing on pouring coffee. But the words followed her home like burrs clinging to her skin. Back at the ranch, Rusty seemed to sense her weariness. One night, after a long shift, she collapsed beside his pen, too tired to speak. Rusty stepped closer, his muzzle brushing against her shoulder. Emily's breath caught. It was the first time he had reached for her without coaxing. "Thank you," she whispered into the dark, tears finally spilling free. "I won't give up on you. Not ever." The road ahead was still steep, lined with doubt and the weight of her father's silence. But under the wide Wyoming sky, with Rusty breathing softly beside her, Emily felt a fragile thread of hope weaving itself between them. It wasn't strength or victory yet, but it was enough to keep walking the hard road home. The summer heat settled heavy over the valley, pressing down on the ranch until even the cicadas grew quiet. Emily wiped the sweat from her brow as she leaned against the fence, watching Rusty chew slowly at the handful of hay she had coaxed him into eating. His ribs still showed. His coat still carried the dullness of neglect, but there was a new steadiness in his gaze that hadn't been there the week before. It gave her hope. Fragile, but bright enough to keep her going. She didn't hear the footsteps until a voice drifted from behind her. "That's one sorry-looking horse you've got there." Emily turned sharply, defensive instinct rising, ready for another cruel remark. Instead, she found a man leaning casually against the gate, his weathered face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. He was tall, his skin bronzed from years beneath the sun, and though his shoulders sloped with age, there was a wiry strength about him. "I didn't mean it cruel," he added, quickly raising his hands in peace. "Name's Miguel Alvarez. I live over the ridge." Emily relaxed a fraction but kept her chin high. "Most folks just laugh." Miguel's mouth quirked. "I've heard them. That's why I figured I'd take a look for myself." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied Rusty with a practiced gaze. Hollow sides, poor muscle tone, and he's favoring that left leg. Emily's heart clenched. "He's not broken. He just needs time." Miguel nodded, surprising her. "I didn't say he was finished. I've seen worse." His voice carried the weight of experience, and Emily leaned forward unconsciously, eager to hear more. "You know horses?" she asked. A shadow flickered across his face. "Used to. Back in California, I rode the tracks, jockey. Then an accident made sure I'd never ride again." He tapped his thigh, and Emily noticed the faint limp in his stance. "Now I keep to myself. But old habits die hard. When I saw you bringing this fellow home, I figured you might need a hand." Emily's guard lowered further, curiosity stirring. "What do you think of him?" Miguel approached the pen, moving slow, his hands open. Rusty's ears flicked nervously, but he didn't shy away. Miguel studied the horse with quiet patience, circling him, watching the way he shifted his weight. Then he crouched slightly, eyes narrowing. "Strong hocks," he murmured. "Back legs built for power, even if the rest of him's run down. If you can rebuild his strength and heal his mind, he could surprise you." Emily blinked. No one else had seen anything but failure in Rusty. Her chest swelled with a mix of relief and gratitude. "That's what I've been trying to tell everyone." Miguel straightened, giving her a long look. "But it's not just his body you'll need to fix. He's been hurt before, bad. You can see it in his eyes. He doesn't trust people, not yet. If you rush him, you'll lose him. Emily nodded slowly. Then we'll take it his way, not mine. For the first time in days, she felt she wasn't entirely alone. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of fire, Miguel stayed to help. He showed Emily how to brush Rusty with slow, steady strokes, letting the horse see and smell every move before touching him. At first, Rusty tensed, muscles twitching under the unfamiliar hands, but after a while, he let out a long breath and lowered his head. "There," Miguel said softly. "That's the sound of a horse letting go. Just a little." Emily smiled, her throat tight with emotion. From the porch, Sam watched, his expression unreadable. His arms were crossed, but his eyes followed every movement. When Miguel finally left, tipping his hat politely, Sam stepped closer to the fence. "You trust that man?" he asked gruffly. Emily met his gaze, unflinching. "He believes Rusty can be more than everyone says. That's enough for me." Sam didn't answer, but his silence carried a heaviness Emily had grown used to. He turned back toward the house, leaving her with the twilight and the horse, who, for the first time, seemed to be watching her not with fear, but with curiosity. That night, Emily lay awake listening to the crickets sing and the soft rustle of Rusty moving in his pen. Miguel's words echoed in her mind. "If you rush him, you'll lose him." She knew the road ahead would be long, but now she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. Somewhere in the dark, hope stirred again. Thin, stubborn, and impossible to ignore. The days slipped into a rhythm of toil and silence, the kind that only ranch life could impose. Emily worked long hours at the diner, came home with her hands raw from dishes and her clothes carrying the smell of grease and coffee, and still found the strength to walk out to Rusty's pen before the stars rose. The ranch was quieter than it used to be. Since her mother's passing, laughter had drained from the house, and Sam's voice carried only orders or criticism. The nights belonged to Emily and the fragile creature she had brought home from ridicule. Rusty was beginning to eat more, small mouthfuls of alfalfa, a few oats here and there. His ribs were still sharp against his hide, but his eyes no longer looked as empty as they had at the auction. Emily saw the difference, though her father remained unmoved. "A half-dead horse that can chew doesn't make him a miracle," he muttered one morning, sipping his coffee as she lugged a bucket of water across the yard. She didn't answer. Words only built walls between them these days. That evening, when the work was finally done, Emily lingered at the stable. The sky was deep indigo, the air filled with the sweet scent of clover. She sat on the edge of the fence, her legs dangling, and watched Rusty shift restlessly in the pen. He flinched at the shadows, ears twitching at every creak of wood. It was clear to her that fear still lived inside him, like a second heartbeat. Without thinking, she began to hum. The melody was one she hadn't sung in years, a tune her mother used to whistle while kneading bread or hanging laundry out to dry. It was a slow country ballad, the kind that carried the loneliness of the plains and the tenderness of home. Emily's voice wavered at first, rusty from disuse, but then it steadied, carrying soft notes into the night. Rusty lifted his head. His ears turned toward her, his dark eyes fixing on the sound. Emily's chest tightened, but she kept singing. The song floated gently between them, weaving through the quiet stable, wrapping itself around horse and girl alike. Rusty took a tentative step forward, then another, until he was standing close to the fence. Emily's voice softened, almost breaking with emotion. "See, boy," she whispered between verses, "no one's going to hurt you here." Rusty exhaled a long breath, the kind that seemed to empty years of fear from his body. Slowly, he stretched his neck forward and pressed his muzzle lightly against her shoulder. Emily froze, her throat thick with tears. It was the first time he had reached for her without hesitation, the first time he had offered something resembling trust. She rested her hand gently along his cheek, feeling the coarse hair under her palm, and let the last notes of the song fade into the night. Behind her, the screen door creaked. Sam stood in the glow of the kitchen light, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He watched silently, the brim of his hat casting his eyes into shadow. When Emily turned, startled, he cleared his throat. "You think a lullaby is going to fix what's broken in that horse?" he asked, his tone gruff. Emily held his gaze, her hand still on Rusty's muzzle. "It's not about fixing him. It's about letting him know he's not alone." Sam's lips pressed into a hard line. For a moment, Emily thought he might soften, might finally acknowledge what he saw. But he only shook his head and stepped back inside, closing the door behind him. The silence that followed was not empty. Rusty stayed pressed against her shoulder, steady and warm, while Emily blinked away tears. Her father could dismiss her efforts, the townsfolk could mock her, but in this quiet moment, she knew something had shifted. Rusty had chosen her song, her presence over his fear. She sang again the next night and the night after that. Each time, Rusty drew nearer until it became their ritual. Her voice, his breath mingling with the melody, the stars wheeling overhead as silent witnesses. The stable, once a place of shadows, grew to feel like a sanctuary. And with every note, the bond between them deepened, threading trust through the fragile fabric of their lives. For Emily, it wasn't just about healing Rusty. It was about keeping alive the part of herself her mother had left behind. The belief that tenderness could be stronger than force, and that sometimes the simplest gifts, like a song in the dark, could change everything. The morning sun rolled across the Wyoming hills like a slow tide of fire, burning away the chill of night. Emily stood at the gate of the small paddock, her hands gripping the lead rope that dangled between her and Rusty. The horse stood rigid, muscles taut beneath his dull coat, eyes wide as though the open pasture beyond was filled with predators instead of grass. Emily's heart beat in rhythm with his tension. Today was the day she would try to lead him past the safety of the pen and into the field. Miguel arrived just as the dew was lifting from the grass, his limp noticeable as he crossed the yard. He carried with him the quiet patience of someone who had seen more setbacks than triumphs, and it reassured Emily to have him nearby. "Don't rush him," Miguel said, his voice low and steady. "Let him decide when he's ready. Forcing him will only remind him of whatever broke him before." Darlene nodded, though her throat felt tight. She had dreamed of this moment for days, of Rusty taking those first steps into freedom, of sunlight catching on his mane like it belonged there. She tugged gently on the rope. Rusty's ears flicked back, his hooves grinding into the dirt. His breathing grew shallow, and every line of his body screamed resistance. "Easy, boy," Emily whispered. She let the rope slacken, showing him she wouldn't drag him. Instead, she stepped forward alone and stood in the field, turning her body sideways in an open stance. She extended her hand, palm upward, a silent invitation. The wind stirred the tall grass, carrying the scent of sage and dust between them. For long minutes, Rusty didn't move. His chest rose and fell quickly, nostrils flaring, eyes darting. But Emily stayed still, patient, her hand unwavering. Then, barely a shift, Rusty took one step forward. His hoof pressed into the grass beyond the pen, and he froze as if expecting pain to follow. When nothing came, he took another. Emily swallowed hard, a smile tugging at her lips. "That's it. You're all right. Just a little further." Rusty edged forward until he stood halfway into the field. Then a branch cracked in the distance, and panic flared through him. He reared, jerking back, nearly pulling the rope from Emily's hand. She stumbled, heart hammering, but she didn't let go. "It's okay. I've got you," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Miguel started forward, but Emily shook her head. "Let me try." The horse trembled, his body quivering with the instinct to flee. Emily slowly loosened her grip, lowering the rope to the ground. She took 3 steps back and sat cross-legged in the grass, turning her eyes to the horizon. She didn't look at Rusty directly, knowing prey animals read intent in every glance. She simply waited, her body saying, "I am not here to trap you. I am here to share this space." Minutes crawled by. Then, slowly, Rusty lowered his head. His breath came in long, shuddering pulls, but the tension drained bit by bit. With a cautious step, then another, he walked into the field and stopped in front of Emily. The rope dragged loosely between them. He lowered his muzzle until it brushed against her shoulder. Emily closed her eyes, relief flooding through her chest. "You did it, boy," she whispered. "You're free, and you're safe." From the fence line, Miguel smiled faintly. "That's the beginning," he murmured. But not everyone shared his quiet pride. When Sam strode across the yard, his face set like stone, Emily felt the fragile moment crack. "You're wasting time," her father said flatly. "All this patience, all this sitting in the dirt, what good will it do? That horse isn't meant for anything but disappointment." Emily rose to her feet, keeping one hand lightly on Rusty's neck. Her eyes locked on her father's, steady despite the sting of his words. "Then let him disappoint me," she said. "At least I'll know I gave him the chance no one else would." Sam stared at her for a long, silent beat. His jaw worked as though he might argue, but then he turned and walked back to the house, shoulders tight with disapproval. Emily exhaled, her body shaking with the effort of standing firm. Rusty stayed beside her, calm now, his ears flicked forward as if curious rather than afraid. For the first time since she had seen him at the auction, Emily felt not just hope, but certainty. He wasn't broken beyond repair. The field stretched wide and open before them, and Rusty had taken his first steps into it. The journey ahead would be long, but today proved that the road existed, and they were walking it together. The small town of Cheyenne was never a place where secrets stayed hidden for long. By the time Emily returned to her evening shift at the diner, the story of her charity case horse had already spread like wildfire. The counter buzzed with laughter as ranch hands nursed their beers and the booths hummed with gossip that cut sharper than barbed wire. "Did you hear?" one man said, his voice loud enough for the whole room. "That Walker girl dragged home a skeleton she calls a horse. Gonna feed him soup and sing him lullabies till he learns to dance." His companions erupted with laughter. Emily gripped the coffee pot tighter, her knuckles whitening. She forced herself to smile politely as she poured refills, her ears burning. Every whisper seemed to follow her, each chuckle a reminder of how little faith anyone had in her or Rusty. By the time she slipped out back for a breath of air, Her chest ached from holding back words she wanted to scream. The night smelled of fried onions and cigarette smoke, the alley behind the diner dim beneath a flickering light. Emily pressed her back to the wall, willing herself not to cry. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw a familiar shape. Miguel, leaning against his old pickup, arms crossed. "Let me guess," he said softly. "They've all turned into experts on horses they've never cared for." Emily gave a small, bitter laugh. "They think I'm a fool. Maybe I am." Miguel shook his head. "No, you're just stubborn. There's a difference, and sometimes stubborn is the only thing that saves a horse. Or a person." His words steadied her, but when she returned home later that night, she found her father waiting on the porch. The lamp behind him cast his face in shadows, but his voice carried the same steel it always did. "You've made us a joke, Emily. Folks are talking, and it's not kind." Emily dropped her bag on the steps, her temper rising. "Let them talk. They don't see what I see." Sam stepped down, his boots thudding against the wood. "What you see won't matter if that horse keels over in the pasture. Then they'll be right, and you'll have wasted everything." The argument cut through the quiet night, sharp and unyielding. Emily turned from him, tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to let him see her cry. Rusty nickered softly from his pen, his ears pricked as if he sensed the storm of voices. Emily crossed to him, resting her forehead against his mane. "We'll prove them wrong," she whispered. "No matter what it takes." The following days brought more than just gossip. They brought Miguel's observations, hints of Rusty's past that chilled Emily's heart. The limp in his step, the way he flinched at sudden noises, the scars hidden beneath his coat all told a story without words. "Somebody pushed him too hard," Miguel said one afternoon, his hand gentle on Rusty's flank. "A horse doesn't get that kind of fear from nothing. He's been broken before, maybe at the track, maybe under a cruel hand. That's why he freezes every time he feels trapped. He doesn't believe escape is possible." Emily's stomach knotted. She pictured the jeers at the auction, the hollow look in Rusty's eyes. How many times had he been discarded, punished, left behind before he ended up there? The thought made her fists clench until her nails dug into her palms. One evening, as the sky flared orange and red, Rusty startled violently at the crack of a gunshot echoing from a neighbor's field. He bolted, ripping the rope from Emily's hands, eyes wild with terror. She ran after him, heart pounding, calling his name. By the time she caught up, he was pressed against the far fence, chest heaving, his whole body trembling like a leaf in a storm. Emily moved slowly, whispering, her hands open. "It's okay, Rusty. You're safe. No one's going to hurt you here." It took long minutes, but eventually he allowed her near. When she touched his cheek, she felt his fear like a living thing under her palm. Later that night, she sat on the porch steps, staring into the dark fields. Miguel's words rang in her ears. He's been broken before. She thought of her father inside the house, silent and judgmental, and of her mother's absence like an unhealed wound. Maybe Rusty wasn't the only one haunted by ghosts. Her resolve hardened. Rusty's past might have left scars, but it didn't define his future. She would fight for him, not just to prove the town wrong, not even to win her father's approval, but because she understood what it meant to carry invisible wounds. Together, they would learn to outrun the shadows. The stars burned cold above the Wyoming sky as Emily whispered her vow into the night. "We're not our past, Rusty. We're something more." The summer rodeo banners had just gone up along Main Street when Emily first saw the notice. A flyer nailed crookedly to the bulletin board outside the feed store. its bright red letters bold against the fading paper. County. Fair jumping contest. All riders welcome. Beneath the headline were promises of prize money, ribbons, and the kind of recognition that could make or break a reputation in their small Wyoming community. Emily stood staring at the flyer, her pulse quickening. She could already picture Rusty. No longer the hollow-eyed horse from the auction, but a renewed creature with strength in his stride, clearing obstacles while the crowd gasped in disbelief. She could hear the silence turning into cheers, the same people who once mocked her, now forced to acknowledge what she had seen from the beginning. When she brought the idea home, though, Sam's reaction was immediate and furious. He slammed the flyer onto the kitchen table, his voice rising with every word. "You think this is some fairy tale, Emily? That horse can barely stand a gunshot without losing his mind, and you want to parade him in front of the whole town? You'll make us the laughingstock of Wyoming." Emily's cheeks flushed with heat, but she held her ground. "He's stronger now. He trusts me. And he needs a chance to prove himself." Sam's eyes flashed. The same steel he once carried into war now turned against his daughter. "What you're really after is proving yourself. Admit it. You want to stand out there and shove it in their faces, but all you'll do is fall flat. And when you do, don't expect me to clean up the mess." The words cut deep, but Emily refused to let them break her. She folded the flyer carefully and slipped it into her pocket, her jaw tight with determination. "If it's a mistake, it's mine to make." For days after, the tension in the house thickened like storm clouds. Sam barely spoke at meals, and when he did, his words carried disapproval like a blade. Miguel, on the other hand, offered cautious encouragement. "A contest might be what Rusty needs," he said one afternoon while helping Emily exercise the horse in the corral. "Not for the prize, not even for the crowd, but because it'll show him he can carry you through fear. That's worth more than a ribbon." Emily's heart soared at his words, though doubt still crept in during the quiet nights. She would lie awake listening to Rusty's shifting weight in the pen outside, wondering if she was asking too much of him too soon. Each time she almost convinced herself to back out, she remembered the hollow look in his eyes the day she brought him home. If she gave up now, she'd be no different than those who had turned away from him at the auction. The weeks leading up to the contest were grueling. Emily rose before dawn, riding Rusty in slow circuits around the pasture, guiding him over makeshift jumps made of barrels and wooden rails. The first attempts were rough. Rusty balked, stumbled, even refused to move some days. But little by little, his body grew stronger, his confidence steadier. Every time he cleared a small obstacle, Emily praised him as though he'd conquered a mountain. Still, setbacks came hard. One windy afternoon, the crack of a falling branch sent Rusty into a frenzy, and Emily was thrown hard into the dirt. She lay there, gasping for breath, pain shooting through her ribs, while Rusty snorted wildly at the far end of the corral. Sam appeared from the porch, his face tight with fury. "This is what I warned you about," he said coldly. "You'll break yourself before that horse ever learns to stand." Emily forced herself to her feet, wiping blood from her lip. "Then let me break trying," she whispered. Sam stared at her, the fight draining from his eyes for just a moment. He turned away without another word, leaving Emily trembling with pain, but more resolved than ever. By the time the fair drew near, Rusty had transformed. His coat shone under the sun, his steps were surer, and though fear still flickered in his eyes, it was tempered by trust. Emily brushed him down on the eve of the contest, her hands moving gently along his flank. Tomorrow's the day, boy, she said softly. Not to prove them wrong, but to prove we were right to believe. That night, she sat alone beneath the wide Wyoming sky, the flyer folded beside her like a promise. The weight of her father's disapproval pressed heavy, but Miguel's quiet faith and Rusty's steady breathing carried her through. Tomorrow would test more than Rusty's strength. It would test her courage, her resilience, and the fragile bond they had built together. Emily closed her eyes and whispered into the night. Whatever happens, we face it together. The county fairgrounds buzzed with noise and color long before the contest began. Bright banners flapped in the wind, the scent of kettle corn and grilled sausages drifting over the packed dirt arena. Families milled about, children tugging at balloons, while riders in crisp jackets and polished boots walked their gleaming horses across the grounds. To Emily, it felt like stepping into another world, one polished, confident, and ready for spectacle. Rusty stood beside her trailer, shifting uneasily, his ears flicking at every burst of laughter and sudden clang of metal. His coat, brushed until it shone, could not disguise the faint scars or the slight hitch in his step. He looked out of place among the powerful thoroughbreds and quarter horses that filled the stables. More than one rider passed with a raised brow or a smirk, their whispers sharp enough for Emily to hear. Isn't that the reject from the auction? She's going to embarrass herself. That poor thing won't last around. Emily's stomach twisted, but she kept her hand steady on Rusty's reins. She whispered softly, her voice low and sure. Don't listen to them, boy. They don't know what I see in you. Miguel appeared at her side, carrying a worn saddle blanket. His eyes scanned the arena with the ease of someone who had lived this world once. Crowd's rough, he muttered, then offered a small smile. But you've already won more than they'll ever understand. Remember that. She nodded, grateful, but her heart pounded all the same. When the announcer's voice boomed over the loudspeakers, the crowd hushed. One by one, riders entered the arena, guiding their horses with precise movements. The animals soared over jumps with effortless grace, drawing applause and cheers. Emily watched every leap, every flawless landing, and felt the weight of doubt press heavier against her chest. Rusty pawed the dirt nervously, his eyes wide. Finally, her name was called. Emily's breath caught as she swung into the saddle, settling into the worn leather. Rusty shifted beneath her, tense but waiting. She patted his neck, leaning close. It's just you and me, like always. The gate opened, and they entered the arena. The world seemed to shrink to the sound of hooves striking dirt. The first jump loomed ahead, a modest rail, nothing higher than what they had practiced in the field. Emily urged Rusty forward, her legs steady, her hands gentle. For a split second, Rusty balked, his body tensing as if fear would root him to the ground. Then, with a surge of effort, he leapt. His hooves clipped the rail, but they cleared it. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed quickly by laughter. Barely made it, someone jeered. Emily blocked it out. Good boy, she whispered. We're just getting started. The second jump came faster, a wider spread. Rusty gathered himself, pushed and soared. Awkward, but determined. They landed hard, but upright. Emily felt his muscles straining beneath her, the tremor of his fear. She steadied him with her voice, murmuring encouragement between every breath. Then came the third obstacle, a taller rail painted in bold stripes. Rusty slowed, his ears flattening. Emily felt his body coil with doubt, his stride faltering. For one terrifying moment, she thought he would stop altogether. Please, Rusty, she whispered, pressing her calves against his sides. Trust me. With a desperate lunge, he jumped. His front hooves scraped the rail, knocking it loose, but they made it across. The bar clattered to the dirt, and the crowd erupted in laughter. Heat flushed Emily's cheeks, but she kept her focus on Rusty. "It doesn't matter," she said firmly. "You did it. You're still here." By the time they reached the final obstacle, a double rail with a narrow landing, Emily's heart hammered so hard it drowned out the crowd. She could feel Rusty's exhaustion, the way each stride shook through his thin frame. Yet she also felt something else. His growing trust. The bond forged in long nights of songs and quiet patience. The moment stretched as they approached. Rusty hesitated, hooves digging into the dirt. The world seemed to hold its breath. Emily leaned forward, her voice breaking with urgency. "One more, boy. Just one more, for both of us." Rusty gathered himself and leapt. Time slowed, the crowd, the noise, the heat of the sun all fading until there was only the horse and the girl. They cleared the first rail, then the second, landing, hard but clean. Dust billowed around them as they stumbled forward, still upright, still moving. The arena erupted, not with cheers at first, but with stunned silence, then a few claps, hesitant, uncertain, rising into applause. Emily exhaled, tears stinging her eyes as she leaned down and wrapped her arms around Rusty's neck. "You did it," she whispered fiercely. "You proved them wrong." From the stands, Sam had watched in stony silence, his arms folded tight across his chest. When Rusty cleared that final jump, something flickered in his expression. Pride, or perhaps the memory of a younger man who once believed in impossible things. He didn't clap, but he didn't leave either. Emily rode Rusty out of the arena, her heart swelling with a mix of triumph and exhaustion. They hadn't won the contest, not by a long shot, but they had faced the trial, stumbled through fear, and come out together. That, to her, was more victory than any ribbon. The fairgrounds were nearly empty by the time Emily led Rusty back to the trailer. The glow of floodlights cast long shadows over the dirt, and the laughter of families drifted away into the night. Rusty's sides heaved with exhaustion, his coat damp with sweat, but his ears flicked forward as if still alert, still proud of what they had accomplished. Emily stroked his neck, her throat thick with emotion. He had stumbled, yes. He had knocked rails and drawn laughter, but he had also jumped when it mattered, carrying her across the last obstacle when no one expected him to. Miguel met them by the gate, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. His face carried the same calm steadiness it always did, but Emily could see the gleam in his eyes. "He did well," he said quietly. Emily almost laughed. "They laughed at us the whole way through." "They laughed," Miguel agreed. "And still he jumped. That's more than most could have done." He stepped forward, running his hand along Rusty's flank. "You both learned something today, and that's worth more than ribbons." Later that night, back at the ranch, Emily sat on the porch steps with her ribs aching from the long ride and her hands raw from holding the reins. Rusty rested in his pen, already dozing, his chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. The stars spilled across the Wyoming sky, cold and endless. She wanted to feel triumphant, but doubt gnawed at her. Was she pushing too hard? Was she dragging Rusty into battles he wasn't ready for just to silence the whispers of the town? The screen door creaked open, and Sam stepped out. He stood there for a long while, without speaking, the glow of his cigarette ember bright in the dark. Finally, his voice cut through the night. "I watched the whole thing." Emily turned, surprised. "I thought you'd left." Sam shook his head. "I stayed. Saw him knock down that rail. Saw him clear the last one." He paused, his gaze drifting to the pen where Rusty lay. "You know, when I was your age, I had a horse like that. Wild, stubborn, and broken in all the wrong ways. Everyone told me he was worthless. Took me years to earn his trust. But once I did, there wasn't a horse more loyal." Emily's heart tightened. It was the first time her father had spoken about his past in weeks. "What happened to him?" she asked gently. Sam exhaled smoke, his eyes clouded with memory. "I sold him. Thought I needed the money more than I needed him. Been regretting it ever since." Silence stretched between them, heavy and raw. For a moment, Emily glimpsed not the hard, unyielding man she'd grown used to, but the soldier who had carried loss and the husband who had buried a wife. His words hung in the air like a warning and a confession, all at once. "Don't make the same mistake I did," Sam said finally, his voice rough. "If that horse is your heart, don't trade him for anyone else's approval." Emily blinked back tears, nodding. "I won't." Sam stubbed out his cigarette and retreated into the house, the screen door shutting softly behind him. Emily stayed outside, staring at the stars until her eyes blurred. For the first time, she felt her father's disapproval soften into something else. Not support, not yet, but perhaps understanding. The days that followed were filled with new determination. With Miguel's guidance, Emily began to refine Rusty's training. They worked not just on strength, but on trust, leading him into noisy spaces, exposing him to sudden sounds, teaching him that fear didn't always mean danger. Some days they succeeded, and Rusty moved with surprising grace. Other days ended in frustration, his panic rising too fast for Emily to reach. But she remembered Sam's story, and each time Rusty faltered, she told herself patience was the true measure of victory. One afternoon, Miguel leaned on the fence, watching as Emily guided Rusty through a series of low jumps. The horse cleared them clumsily, but without hesitation. Miguel smiled faintly. "He reminds me of myself," he said. Emily tilted her head. "How so?" Miguel's expression grew distant. "I was good. Too good, maybe. Won races I had no business winning. People put their money on me like I was a sure thing. But one fall ended it all. Broke my leg and my career in one breath. After that, everyone stopped believing in me. Took me years to stop believing their voices." Emily slowed Rusty to a walk, listening. Miguel's words carried the same pain she had seen in Rusty's eyes, the same ghosts she herself carried. "What changed?" she asked softly. Miguel shrugged. "I stopped trying to prove them wrong. Started trying to prove myself right. There's a difference." That night, Emily wrote the words down in her journal, the paper smudged with dust from her hands. "Prove myself right." It became her quiet mantra, one she whispered to Rusty before every ride. She no longer dreamed of silencing the town's laughter. She dreamed of building something between them strong enough to outlast it. As autumn painted the Wyoming hills gold, Emily felt the shift inside her. Rusty was no longer the weak horse she had rescued. He was her partner, scarred but unbroken. And she realized that perhaps the greatest lesson was not about what Rusty could become, but what he was teaching her about herself. The morning of the rodeo dawned bright and sharp. The Wyoming sky stretched wide and endless above the valley. Emily woke before the first rooster crowed, her nerves already churning. Rusty stood in the paddock, his coat brushed until it glistened like copper under the rising sun. He turned his head when she approached, ears flicking, as though sensing the weight of the day. By the time they reached the fairgrounds, the place was alive with motion. Flags snapped in the breeze, vendors shouted from behind counters stacked with cotton candy and fried dough, and music from a fiddle band drifted across the crowd. Horses gleamed in the morning light, their riders dressed in starched shirts and polished boots, spurs catching the sun. The air was charged with anticipation, the kind of electric hum that made even the most seasoned competitors restless. Emily led Rusty through the throng, aware of the stares that followed her. She heard the whispers ripple through the spectators as they recognized the horse at her side. "That's the one from the auction," someone muttered. "The reject." Others laughed openly. "She's wasting her time. Poor girl doesn't know when to quit." Her cheeks flushed, but she kept her eyes fixed forward, her hand steady on Rusty's reins. Miguel walked beside her, his limp pronounced, but his gaze firm, offering quiet reassurance. "Let them talk," he murmured. "Their voices don't matter once you're in the ring." Still, the weight of ridicule pressed hard. Emily remembered every jeer from the diner, every shake of the head from her neighbors. She felt the weight of her father's doubt, too, heavier than the saddle she carried. Sam had refused to come that morning, muttering something about not watching a disaster. But she had seen the hesitation in his eyes, the flicker of pride he tried to bury. Whether he showed up or not, she would ride for him as much as for herself. When her name was called, Emily mounted Rusty, her legs trembling against the stirrups. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena, rattling through the metal bleachers. The crowd hushed, curious to see the girl who had brought a half-dead horse back from nothing. Rusty pawed the ground, nostrils flaring, but Emily leaned close, her voice soft and steady. "We've done this before, boy. Just you and me. Breathe with me." The gate swung open, and they entered. The noise of the crowd seemed to vanish, replaced by the pounding of Rusty's hooves on packed dirt. The first obstacle stood ahead, painted rails bright against the arena dust. Emily felt Rusty hesitate, his stride faltering. She whispered encouragement, nudging him gently forward. With a powerful push, he cleared the jump. The landing was rough, but they were still moving. A smattering of applause broke out, hesitant but real. The second jump loomed, higher than the first. Rusty gathered himself, his body quivering with the effort. Emily steadied him with her voice, and together they soared over the rail, landing harder this time, but upright. A ripple of surprise swept through the stands. Then came the third, a wide spread that tested both power and courage. Rusty balked, hooves grinding into the dirt, his muscles screaming refusal. Emily's heart lurched, but she leaned forward, pressing her calves firmly. "Trust me," she breathed. With a desperate surge, Rusty leapt. His hooves clipped the edge, knocking a rail loose, but they cleared it. The rail clattered to the ground, and the crowd burst into laughter. Emily's cheeks burned, but she forced herself not to look at them. "It doesn't matter," she whispered fiercely. "You're doing it." The final obstacle was the tallest, a double rail that had bested even seasoned riders earlier in the day. Emily felt Rusty falter, his body heavy beneath her, his breath coming hard. She closed her eyes, trusting the bond they had built. "One more, Rusty. Just one more for us." The horse surged forward, gathering every ounce of strength. Time seemed to stretch as they soared, clearing the first rail, then the second. They landed hard, stumbling, but they did not fall. A hush fell over the arena, broken only by the echo of hooves on dirt. Then slowly, applause began to swell, rising into a cheer that carried across the fairgrounds. Emily leaned low, wrapping her arms around Rusty's neck, her throat tight with tears. "You did it, boy," she whispered. "You proved them wrong." In the crowd, Sam had appeared after all, standing at the back with his arms crossed. His face was unreadable, but his eyes followed every step as Emily guided Rusty from the arena. For the first time, his shoulders seemed to soften, his gaze lingering on his daughter with something that looked very much like pride. They hadn't won the contest. They hadn't placed at all. But as Emily dismounted, surrounded by murmurs of disbelief and admiration, she knew they had claimed something far greater. Rusty had faced the crowd, faced his fear, and carried her through. Together, they had turned doubt into silence, and silence into applause. For Emily, the rodeo fair was not the end of their journey. It was the beginning of something far larger than she had dared to dream. The days after the rodeo fair were strangely quiet. Emily felt as if the whole town was watching her more closely now, waiting to see if the girl with the broken horse could hold on to her fragile triumph. At the diner, customers no longer laughed out loud, but their whispers carried the same sharpness. "She got lucky," one woman murmured. "Next time they'll both fall flat." Emily ignored them, though the words clung to her like dust. Back at the ranch, Rusty was different. Something in him had shifted since the contest. He no longer stood at the far edge of the pen, but waited for Emily near the gate, ears pricked forward. When she sang at night, he leaned against her shoulder, his breath steady and warm. Miguel noticed it too. "He's not just surviving anymore," he said one afternoon, leaning on his cane as Rusty cleared a practice rail with surprising grace. "He's beginning to believe." Sam, however, kept his distance. He offered no praise, no acknowledgement, only long glances from the porch that betrayed nothing. Emily longed for him to say something, anything, but the silence between them felt like another obstacle she didn't know how to clear. One evening, Miguel arrived with a new challenge. He carried a stack of wooden poles and set them in the pasture, higher and wider than anything Rusty had attempted before. "If you want him ready for real competition, he has to face more than what's comfortable," he said. Emily's pulse quickened as she watched Rusty snort at the strange setup, pawing the dirt nervously. The first attempts were clumsy. Rusty balked, refused, even skittered sideways in fear. Emily steadied him each time, her voice calm, though her heart hammered. "It's okay, boy. We'll try again." By the fifth attempt, Rusty gathered himself and leapt, awkward but determined. He landed hard but upright, and Emily threw her arms around his neck in relief. Miguel's eyes softened. That's the heart of a champion. Not perfection, but persistence. But their true test came sooner than Emily expected. A storm rolled over the valley one night, wind lashing the windows, thunder cracking like rifle fire. Rusty panicked in his pen, eyes wide with terror, slamming against the fence until it shook. Emily ran barefoot through the mud, her dress plastered to her skin, and found him wild-eyed, drenched in rain. "Easy, Rusty," she shouted over the roar of thunder, grabbing the rope. He reared, nearly wrenching it from her hands. Miguel appeared out of the dark, his hat soaked, his limp slowing him but not stopping him. "Let him feel you," he yelled. "Not the storm, not the fear, just you." Emily pressed her forehead to Rusty's muzzle, ignoring the rain stinging her eyes. "It's me, boy. Just me. I won't leave you." Slowly, Rusty's breathing slowed, his trembling eased. The thunder still cracked, but he no longer tried to flee. He stood pressed against her, trusting her voice over the storm. When the skies finally cleared, Emily led him back to the barn, her body shaking with exhaustion. Miguel clapped a hand to her shoulder. "That," he said firmly, "was the moment that defines everything. He chose you over fear." Sam stood at the barn door, watching silently. For a heartbeat, Emily thought he might speak, but he only nodded once and turned away. Yet that small gesture was more than she had ever expected. The next morning, the valley sparkled with rain-washed light. Rusty stood tall in the pasture, the sun catching his coat until it gleamed. Emily leaned on the fence, her heart swelling. The storm had tested them both, and they had come through together. She realized then that victory wasn't just about clearing rails or silencing laughter. It was about moments like this, when trust was stronger than fear, when hope outweighed doubt. And for the first time, she felt certain. They were no longer just trying to survive. They were ready to begin becoming something greater. Word of Rusty's surprising performance at the fair spread farther than Emily expected. What had once been mockery now turned into a mix of curiosity and grudging respect. Strangers stopped by the diner to ask about the girl with the auction horse, and kids pressed against the fence at the ranch, hoping to catch a glimpse of the once-forgotten animal. Emily accepted it with humility, though she knew how quickly admiration could turn back to scorn. Rusty seemed to sense the shift, too. His stride grew more confident, his eyes brighter, as though he understood that he was no longer invisible. Emily trained him tirelessly, pushing herself harder than ever. Each evening, as the Wyoming sun bled into the horizon, she set up new jumps, higher and wider, and urged Rusty forward. Some days he soared, carrying her effortlessly across. Other days he faltered, and Emily tumbled into the dirt, bruised and breathless. But she always rose, brushing herself off with grit in her teeth. Sam watched from the porch, silent as ever, though his gaze lingered longer now. Sometimes, late at night, Emily glimpsed him walking the pasture alone, pausing near Rusty's pen. He never spoke of it, but she knew he was wrestling with something: pride, fear, or perhaps memories he couldn't bury. Then came the knock at the ranch gate. A sleek black truck pulled up, polished until it gleamed against the dust. Out stepped a man in a pressed suit and polished boots, his smile sharp as a blade. "Miss Walker?" he asked, his tone smooth. "Name's Dalton. I represent a group of investors down in Texas. Word is you've got a horse that's turned quite a few heads." Emily stiffened, her hand tightening on Rusty's lead rope. Dalton's gaze slid over the horse, calculating, assessing, like a banker sizing up collateral. "He's come a long way from the skeleton folks laughed at. My clients are prepared to make you a generous offer. $500,000 for him. Cash." The number hit like a thunderclap. $500,000, more money than Emily had ever dreamed of. Enough to pay off every debt, rebuild the ranch, and secure a future her family had been struggling to grasp since her mother's death. For a heartbeat, her breath caught with the weight of temptation. Sam emerged from the porch, his expression tightening as he heard the words. "She's not interested," he snapped, his voice like gravel. Dalton smiled thinly. "I think that's for her to decide." He turned back to Emily, lowering his voice just enough to sound intimate. "Think of what you could do. College, a new start, maybe even more horses. One's bred for greatness. Don't chain yourself to a dream that will only drag you down." Rusty shifted uneasily, his ears flicking back as though he could sense the tension. Emily stroked his neck, her throat tight. She saw her father's jaw clench, the storm brewing in his eyes. But she also saw the hunger there, the weight of debts, and the memory of mistakes he'd never forgiven himself for. The silence stretched. Then Sam said, quieter this time, "It's your choice, Emily. But remember what I told you. Don't make the same mistake I did." Emily lifted her chin, her decision firming with every beat of her heart. "Rusty isn't for sale," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. Dalton's smile faltered, the charm slipping into irritation. "You're making a foolish choice. Opportunities like this don't come twice." Emily held his gaze. "Neither do second chances. He's mine, and we've come too far together to let anyone put a price on him." For a long moment, Dalton stared at her, his eyes cold. Then he shrugged, adjusting his jacket. "Suit yourself. But don't be surprised when the world leaves you behind again." He climbed back into his truck, the engine roaring as it pulled away, leaving a trail of dust in its wake. The yard fell silent. Emily turned to her father, bracing for anger. But Sam only studied her for a long time, then gave a single nod. It wasn't approval exactly, but something deeper, a recognition of her resolve. That night, Emily sat in Rusty's pen, her head resting against his warm flank. She thought of the fortune she had turned down, of the easier life she had rejected. Yet as Rusty breathed calmly beside her, his trust unwavering, she felt no regret. Glory had its price, but so did loyalty. And in that moment, she knew which one she would choose every time. The sun dipped low across the Wyoming plains, bathing the Walker Ranch in a warm orange glow. Emily leaned against the fence, watching Rusty graze in the paddock, his coat shimmering with a shine she once thought impossible. He looked nothing like the half-dead creature she had led home from the auction. He moved with quiet confidence, each step firm, each breath steady. For Emily, he was more than a horse. He was the proof that belief could breathe life back into what the world had discarded. But the memory of Dalton's visit lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon. The offer had been outrageous, a fortune that could change everything for her and her father. Sam had said little since then, though Emily often caught him gazing at the fields with a faraway look, as if he were imagining what that money could repair. She feared he saw only debts cleared and fences mended, while she saw the cost of selling her soul. That evening, Sam finally spoke. They sat at the kitchen table, the hum of the old refrigerator the only sound in the room. "You know that money could have saved this place," he said quietly, his weathered hands folded together. $500,000, Emily. Enough to start over. Emily met his gaze, her voice steady. "I don't want to start over without Rusty. He's not for sale." Sam's jaw tightened, but his eyes softened in a way she hadn't expected. "I sold the best horse I ever had once. Thought I was doing the right thing. Spent the money, and it was gone. But the regret stayed. I don't want that for you." Her chest ached, hearing the admission. "Then trust me, Dad, I won't make that mistake." For the first time in months, Sam gave her a small smile. It was faint, but it carried a weight of pride she hadn't seen in years. A week later, Dalton returned. This time, he didn't come alone. 2 men stepped out of the truck with him, their boots too clean for ranch work, their suits too stiff for Wyoming dust. Dalton's smile was tight, his tone rehearsed. "Miss Walker, I'll give you one last chance. $1 million. Cash. You could fix this ranch, pay for college, Buy yourself 10 horses better than this one. Don't throw away your future for sentiment." Emily felt Rusty shift beside her, his body tense as if he sensed the pressure in Dalton's words. She stroked his neck, her decision already firm. "Rusty isn't for sale at any price." Dalton's smile cracked, replaced by a sneer. "You're a fool. That horse will never bring you anything but disappointment. One day you'll wish you'd taken my offer." Emily stepped closer to Rusty, her chin high. "Maybe so, but at least I'll still have him. And that's worth more than anything you could put in a check." Dalton studied her for a long moment, his eyes cold and sharp. Then he turned, gesturing for his men to follow. The truck roared to life, spitting dust as it sped down the road. Emily watched until it vanished beyond the ridge, her heart hammering with both fear and relief. Sam had been standing nearby, silent as always. When Dalton left, he walked over, his boots crunching in the gravel. For a moment, Emily braced herself for another lecture. Instead, Sam rested his rough hand on her shoulder. "I was wrong about you," he said simply. "You've got more grit than I ever did." The words sank into Emily like sunlight after a long winter. She looked at Rusty, who nickered softly as if echoing the sentiment, and felt something inside her settle. She had made her choice, and her father had finally seen it. That night, Emily lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling. The ranch was quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind across the plains. She thought of the road ahead, the competitions, the doubts, the whispers that would never fully vanish. But she also thought of Rusty, and of the bond they had forged in the shadows of ridicule and storms. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she no longer feared the cost of refusing. Rusty was priceless. No offer could change that. When morning came, Emily walked out to the paddock. Rusty trotted toward her, ears pricked, eyes bright. She leaned her forehead against his and whispered, "We're in this together, no matter what comes." And for the first time, she truly believed it. The seasons turned over the Wyoming hills, each one leaving its mark on the ranch and on the lives bound together there. Winter brought biting winds that rattled the shutters and froze water buckets solid overnight, but Emily never missed a dawn feeding. Spring thawed the land, painting the pastures green, and Rusty ran with a strength that once seemed impossible. By summer, their names were known beyond Cheyenne. Whispers carried through neighboring towns of the girl who had turned a forgotten horse into a champion. Emily and Rusty entered more contests, not for trophies, but for the bond that grew stronger with each leap. Crowds that once mocked now leaned forward in awe when Rusty cleared rails higher than his broken past should have allowed. Children pressed their hands against arena fences, their faces glowing with wonder, and sometimes Emily heard them whisper, "That's the horse nobody wanted." The words no longer carried scorn, they carried reverence. But glory was never her true prize. What mattered most was the quiet moments, brushing Rusty's coat under the golden light of dusk, feeling the steady thrum of his breath, hearing her father's voice soften as he finally began to share in her pride. Sam never apologized in so many words, but the way he stood at her side at every show, his hand resting on the rail, said more than words ever could. His daughter had become everything he once dreamed of being, and Rusty had helped bring that out of her. Years passed, and with them came changes. Emily grew into a woman with calloused hands and eyes sharpened by determination. Rusty, once frail and forgotten, aged with her. His coat silvered, his stride slowed, but his spirit never dimmed. When he finally retired from competition, Emily let him roam the pasture freely, knowing he had earned a life of peace. Yet his story did not end in silence. Children from town visited often, wide-eyed as they listened to Emily tell Rusty's tale by the fence line. She would point to the scar on his leg, the ribs that once showed through his skin, and then gesture to the proud way he still held his head. "They all thought he was worthless," she would say. "But he taught me that worth isn't what others see. It's what we choose to believe in." And the children would gather around Rusty, stroking his muzzle, their laughter ringing across the valley. What an autumn evening. Emily sat on the porch beside her father, the air crisp and filled with the scent of pine. Rusty grazed in the fading light, his silhouette framed against the setting sun. Sam, older now, leaned heavily on his cane, his voice roughened but warm. "Do you realize what you've done, Em? That horse didn't just change you. He changed this family. He changed everyone who's ever heard his story." Emily's eyes stung with tears. She rested her chin on her knees, watching Rusty lift his head toward the wind as though he owned the horizon. "Sometimes I wonder if I saved him, or if it was the other way around." Sam chuckled softly, his gaze fixed on the horse. "Maybe it was both." As twilight deepened, stars spilled across the Wyoming sky, vast and endless. Emily walked down to the pasture one last time that night, pressing her forehead gently to Rusty's. His breath was warm, his eyes still bright with the fire that had carried them through storms, doubt, and ridicule. She whispered the words she had carried since that first day at the auction. "You'll never be unwanted again." Rusty nickered softly, as if answering her. In the years that followed, his legend grew. Folks told the story at rodeos, at diners, in quiet barns where children begged for tales of hope. They spoke of the horse that had been rejected, sold for nearly nothing, and of the girl who believed when no one else dared to. Rusty became more than a horse. He became a symbol. A reminder that broken things could be made whole, that the overlooked could rise, and that sometimes the greatest victories were not written in ribbons or money, but in love, loyalty, and the courage to keep believing. And so, beneath the wide Wyoming sky, the story of Emily and Rusty became a part of the land itself, etched into the wind that swept across the plains and the stars that lit the long nights. A legend born not of perfection, but of faith. And that's the story of Emily and Rusty, the horse nobody wanted, who became a legend. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments, so I know you're here with me. Don't forget to hit subscribe, because the next stories will take you on even more unforgettable journeys of humans and animals that will move you to tears. Stay tuned.